approaching the beginning of the school year once more, we're going to take a break from our travels around the world and get back to the nuts and bolts of education. And what could be more appropriate than looking at the mysterious world behind the making of the publisher's books that most of us are going to begin using once those bright smiley faces of our students walk through the classroom door. And I have the expert for you. Rachel Long has been generously loaned to us from Macmillan Press, and she's going to tell us not only what's actually on those pages that our students and children turn to every day of the school year, but more importantly, what's behind those pages. It's frankly magical to be able to make some sense out of a part of the educational world that's always represented for me, and I'm going to be dramatic here, what a surprise, a type of handcuffs in the teaching environment, mostly because when I was in the classroom, I didn't have a choice of books, and nobody explained to me before today the value of what goes on behind them. So let's listen to the marvelous Rachel Long, and you tell me if you're convinced in the end if these books don't chain us to static learning, but rather give us wings to fly in the classroom. And also, please tell me what PARSNIPS means by the end of this in the publishing world, whether you believe it's valid or not, and what you're going to look for in the teacher's books from now on. Let's begin. So perfect. Rachel, thank you so much for being here and for your generosity. You're here to represent Macmillan, and you're going to tell us a lot of things about marketing that, first of all, I don't know about, and probably a lot of things that our listeners don't know about. So I think the best place to start is, let's just say I'm a parent or teacher and someone hands me a Macmillan book and I'm thinking, okay, so I have to use this book or I have to pay for this book. Why? Why do I need to pay for this book? So let's start there. No pressure, no pressure.
What is the value of a book? I think part of it is the terminology in itself, is that traditionally it was just a book, and it's so much more than that now. Obviously, there's the whole digital aspect is incorporated. So a book can have 10 components. It's got the audios, it's got the songs, it's got the videos, it's got the digital version with interactive activities, it's got extra booklets, it's got the activity book. Just saying the book, I think, probably does make a lot of parents think, what is this that I'm using? And also, I think there's not a lot known about the life cycle of how the book comes to be. One course book can take up to 4 years to create. And you know, as you've been involved in creating textbooks, that there's a whole city of people behind it. You've got the beginning of the process, there's a research team that sits down with teachers and talks to them about what their needs are, what their students' needs are, the diversity in the classroom, the problems that they have, the problems that need solving. And so each new book that comes out meets the updated reality of the classroom. And then the editorial team comes up with the concept and decides on the methodology that's going to be used for the course book. There's a whole world behind it that requires a huge amount of effort and organization from a lot of people.
All right, so let's go into that a little more, because as you say, you're not just holding a book, you're holding a lot of research, you're holding a lot of expertise, but I'm a teacher. Let's just say I'm a teacher. Well, I am a teacher, and I'm really curious about different types of educational material that I could offer my students, and I want to create my own little lesson. What is the difference between me creating my lesson, going to YouTube and finding a video that might supplement it, and what Macmillan can offer or any publication could offer?
I think the main thing that the main publishers, the educational publishers, offer is expertise, the pedagogy and the methodological understanding behind the content that's put together. Because while there is a huge offer at the moment on YouTube or apps or books or films that you can use for education, and I think that's great, and every extra helps. And certainly when it comes to a language, it's a case of practice, practice, practice. So I think that watching Harry Potter in the evening is also a great way of practicing language. What an educational publisher or any kind of educational materials creator provides is the previous research and the pedagogy that there's a term that's used within publishing a lot, which I'm sure you're more than familiar with, which is scaffolding. And that's in organizing the content in a way that's logical so that it facilitates the learning process. And then also from the teacher's point of view, it gives a huge amount of support. So it's done according to the national or the local curriculum. It's organized in a way that's logical. It's organized for the maturity of the student. It's not the same communicating a topic to a 5-year-old as a 15-year-old. So it's all thought through, and the content is relevant. It's interesting and motivating. You've got new books are created every couple of years, and that means that it's current. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got the person of pop culture interest for the kids, that's the sort of the here and now, but also you've got all of this research behind that means that each time it's a very methodologically sound tool to use that uses the most recent trends. So for example, there's a lot of talk in education at the moment about neuroeducation, about using investigation on the brain, how we think and how we learn, to focus the materials in a way that can be more easily accessed and diversifies to give support to different ways of learning. So while perhaps Pythagoras' theorem won't change, there are different ways of transmitting this information in a way that everyone in the class can understand it. There are different ways of learning grammar, there are different ways of doing different things, and obviously the addition of technology is a fantastic tool in this, and it's changing constantly.
What I hear you're saying above all, however, is the fact that it's very possible that a lot of teachers, as enthusiastic as they may be, may not have a concrete methodology that is linear, that they use in all of their lessons. So what I hear you're saying in the books is that there's a specific methodology that your publication or other publications may follow, and that's also added to the value. Is that right?
Yeah, what the publishing industry provides is effectively a guide for teachers. So on the one hand, there's the curriculum, which guides them in terms of time, what to teach and when. But then there's also a huge range of tools, such as teacher training. So ongoing teaching for teachers, effectively train the trainer on how to apply different methodologies. Or obviously, we do a huge amount of investigation. So that means that we have up-to-date information on what works and why it works. And this is information that perhaps not all teachers, it's a huge pain point for teachers. The information that we get back from them when we speak to them is that there's no funding for training. There's no funding and there's no time. Teachers are under an increasing amount of stress, and I've heard teachers in interviews say, I sleep 5 hours a night because I've got so much admin to do, and I've got this, that and the other, and it's all well and good if you've just come out of doing your degree for teaching, but then the day-to-day catches up with you. And so we offer a lot of information and training for them. And then there's the teacher's book, which is very undervalued. So every book that we create for students has an equivalent teacher's book, which is a guide for teachers, and it's a wealth of resources which often gets forgotten about, and it's got tips for specific activities. So that could be extra things like, before you start this book in September, here's a bunch of icebreakers. How do you get the class feeling comfortable? How do you create a dynamic that works so that your students trust you and that they enjoy the lessons? And it helps teachers follow the course book, which for them depends on the teaching method. It can be something that they can follow exactly as it is, or some teachers will do it in their own way, or want to be more creative and adapt or add to the resources that have been clearly laid out for them as a guide.
All right, so I'm really glad you brought up the teacher's book, because again, when a parent is holding a book and someone says, you need to pay this money, they're also paying for a teacher's book. And what they're also paying for is teacher training, from what you're saying. And I know very little about marketing. I'm going to say that again. But what I hear you say, and when we talked a little bit a week or so ago, you explained to me that the training is very important. The teacher's book is very important. And I explained to you that I have written teachers' books. And what you're saying is very true. I wrote them for Oxford, and I'm going to say another publication, because I think that if one publisher gets better, all of them get better, because I know that they sort of study each other's styles. Yeah. And you also know that I am big on scaffolding, and I added scaffold to the teachers' books. And I'm mentioning this because very rarely have I heard teachers using those teachers' books. Mm-hmm. And when we did talk, I mentioned to you that when teachers do say to me, oh my goodness, I love this publication, the teachers' book is so useful, they do sleep at night. It's the teachers who really don't know how valuable the teachers' book itself is and how much goes into it, that they are frustrated every time they get a new book They have to learn it all over again and create activities that they don't have to create. So tell us again how important the teacher's book is and what parents could actually say to a teacher and a teacher can remember.
Yeah, well, and not just the teacher's book, all of the resources that come with the method itself. It's amazing when before the teachers choose to adopt the book and prescribe it to their students before they buy it, quite often the teacher will say, I really like this particular method because it has XYZ interesting component. And it's all well and good. There's a fabulous component in one of our books, which as a language student and a language teacher, I think is the best thing ever, which is called the Virtual Classroom Exchange. And that is effectively a language exchange, which is done online. And it's set up through a platform which allows classes in one country to do a language exchange and do shared projects with classes in another country. And obviously, we've all been through the pandemic. Everybody's become more tech savvy. Travel was stopped altogether for a while, but even now, not everybody necessarily can afford to travel as much as it would be wonderful to. So it's a fantastic tool that teachers can use to get more out of their teaching and more out of their classes and inspire their students. But often, like with the teacher's book, there are all these wonderful things that make up the value of the course that then, when it comes down to it, don't get used due to lack of time or because there's such a wide offer of a spectrum of components that it gets forgotten about. So no, I think there's more than teachers and students can get through, but there's certainly useful things everywhere.
All right, well, then let's talk also about the fact that you're working with English books, correct? For second language or third language or fourth language learning, whichever one, however many home languages you have. What do we say to parents who did not study English and are paying a lot of money for a book that their children are going to use? And they say, but I can't help them. I'm frustrated paying this book because I can't help them. And so it seems like, I don't know, waste of money? I'm not sure.
I think the opposite really is the thing to say to them, that if they can't help, then it's like all the more reason to buy something that is done by experts who do know about languages, who do know how to use the methodology to get students' brains working and learning in the correct order in a way that actually the information will stay. And I think that families are more and more aware of how English is the kind of international currency now. It's become the main go-to foreign language. So they do want their kids to learn. I know all of my friends in my personal life with little kids only put the television in English. They use me to speak to their kids in English. It's helpful if you have a friend who's a native speaker who you can turn into a nanny. But there are so many options now. You've got loads of apps for kids that are gamified apps that let kids have fun in English. You've got loads of access to songs in English, to videos in English, and all these resources that parents can safely give their kids access to at home. But I think that the materials they're using in schools have so much content that ends up being extra because they can't get through it all in the school year, that is well thought through, that's something that they can sit down with their kids and have a look at them. And they may not understand everything, but also one of the things we know about learning is that one of the best ways to cement your knowledge is to test yourself by explaining it to someone else. So I think in the same way that when people talk about the dangers of video games, and the advice from the experts is, well, if you want to know what your child's playing, why don't you sit down with them while they're playing the video game? Equally with their homework, sit down with your kid and ask them to explain to you if you don't know it. And if you do know it, fantastic, then you can practice with them. But as a language learner, I think we all just have to check your ego at the door. Languages are very difficult and you will always make mistakes and you will never be a native speaker, and that's part of the fun. So I think parents should just not be intimidated by it, enjoy it, use it as an excuse to learn something new and to spend some time with your kids and let them teach you.
So what I'm hearing you say is that if we can lose our fear of our children or who knows, our next door neighbor learning a language that we know nothing about, we could actually learn with them. And I have seen that. I mean, I have neighbors who are learning. I live in Valencia and the students have to learn Valenciano. And because I love languages and I love learning, I will sit down with them and learn as much as I can from the book. It's not fun all the time, but it is exciting when I learn with them. So what you're saying is, holding that book is an opportunity for parents to learn. And what I also hear you're saying that's so important, and I love the idea, is because there are only a certain amount of hours in the classroom, some of the projects and elements and resources in the books, in the publisher's books in Macmillan, can be used at home if they're not going to be used in the classroom, which helps the children and the parents, right?
Yes, and certainly I think in the case of the digital, which is becoming more and more common amongst all the publishers, we have a gamified digital environment called Navio for primary school children. And during the pandemic, it was amazing how many families and how many teachers said, how did I not know about this before? This is amazing. I've got the kids at home while I'm working, and we put them in this environment that we know is safe, because compared to something like YouTube and the kids could be looking at anything, if you've got an application that is made for education and is a closed application and the kids can't leave it, they're using this, then you can leave them to it and they can be autonomous in their learning and do something that they find fun. In the app that we have, they get to make their own avatar. They can change their avatar if they gain a series of points that they've done through answering questions in English and practicing English. And what we find often is that the kids are using it at home, and it created to allow them to practice what they're learning in class, but the kids ask to use it. It's been amazing to see. A dad said to us, when my kid's bored on a Saturday, he says, can I use Navio? Can I use Navio? And we thought, well, great. What he's effectively saying is, can I do extra homework? But it's done in a way that's more accessible to them, and it's in a safe environment.
Yeah, and the kids love to show what they've done, their creativity. They love to show it to their parents at home. And so, yeah, what you're saying is it's another way of continuing the learning process. And what you've also reminded me of is another element of books. I mean, I'm American and I grew up with Dick and Jane books, literally, Dick and Jane. I think you're probably familiar with them. And they're, it's a little white boy and a little white girl, and they're perfect little kids. And the language is very simple, but it's the images is what I want to talk about. What I get a little frustrated with is when I open a textbook and it's showing just one part of society and it's not representing everyone else. So what can you tell us about what a lot of publications are doing today about that?
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue not reflecting the reality in society, and I think it's something that certainly internally those of us that work in it are very aware of and are very keen to change, and we're working on changing it, which is what's often referred to now as diversity, equity, and inclusion. How can we represent everyone? Everyone is a very tall order, but effectively what you want is for every child to see somebody who is living a similar experience to them represented. So that's something that's changing hugely in the artwork of the pictures, so that you don't just have the little blonde boy or little blonde girl, and that you've got a mixture. And in fact, I heard a teacher say fairly recently that they'd looked for their school in the area of Madrid where the school is. They have a lot of different nationalities in that area, and that they had specifically chosen a textbook that had a lot of pictures of little girls with headscarves, because for them that was very representative, and that was a big part of their decision making. And I think it's vital at the moment that we be a part of this change, that society is what it is, and we need to be reflecting different family models, different abilities, be them physical abilities or neurodiverse abilities, but everything that is happening in the world is something that the language classroom, at the end of the day, it gives you so much more freedom that we don't have necessarily in other subject areas, to discuss everything, to question everything, to create conversations about any aspect of life. So it's important to start showing this.
All right. So what I think you're saying is that specifically in Macmillan, I'm sure in other publications, but specifically in the publications you're working on, if a parent opens a book, they're going to see different representations of children in their neighborhood. And what really is important about that is that when a child feels welcome in their class, in his or her classroom, and feels represented and seen and heard, that child, I mean, it's literally the limbic system in the brain. You're talking about neural research. The limbic system is going to relax and let the information in. And so one thing parents can do is open that book and look at it and see all of the thinking, the philosophy, and the compassion behind what may not be so evident with just looking at the cover. Does that sound?
Yeah, although that said, the covers actually quite often are very representative, with a child in a wheelchair on the front cover, or a child with Down syndrome on the front cover. Or for the younger children, there's usually a mixture between fantasy and reality, which is nice as well, that you've got a sort of mixture of cartoon animals and real children doing things like them. But I think it's, as you say, it's sort of setting the creating a setting in which they're comfortable to learn, which is fundamental, and where they see themselves represented and they feel like they belong. But then beyond that, it's also teaching them a set of values. And that's something that's becoming, personally, I think is fantastic, that we've moved past the pure academic acquiring knowledge, and we're taking into consideration everything that prepares students for the future, which is a series of competencies and a series of values. So you've got social and emotional learning is something that's included in all of our books, and values, encouraging empathy, critical thinking, which at the moment with technology and the development of artificial intelligence, these are things that are vital for the future, that the current generation needs, but certainly the future generation will need even more so. So the fact that we're talking about different kinds of families or different cultures or different customs in the language classroom is a really good place to be really cultivating these skills and competencies.
So what I hear you're saying is that before, the books that I had access to and that I worked on were very focused on the cognitive process. And what I believe you're saying now is that there's much more of a focus on the competences that students need, the emotional competences, and all of those skills that they'll need that technology can't do. And so the books have the focus of developing all of their skills instead of just cognitive skills. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I think to me, education is a mixture of all of these things. Obviously, it's vital to have the knowledge, but you also need the skills to be able to apply the knowledge. So these main skills that we've talked about, and communication and the values, and that in turn creates a better school environment, brings down the levels of bullying, and makes a better learning environment. So although they may all seem like little things, they all add up and they all lead to less school dropouts, and it helps children learn if they feel like they're accepted and included and supported.
I am going back to the image of this parent holding a book thinking, what in the world does this book contain? And you're saying it encompasses so much more than just linguistics. And there's something else that you mentioned when we talked a while ago. It's PARSNIPS. It's a term that I was completely unfamiliar with, and it's tangential to what we're talking about here with diversity. Could you explain that term?
Yeah, I just looked it up actually before we met, because I thought this is an acronym that I need to double check I remember all of them. It's similar to what they say about don't talk about politics and religion at a dinner party. That's the general idea with PARSNIPS. It's the kind of go-to acronym of what are potentially controversial topics that are deemed taboo and potentially inappropriate to include in educational resources. So it's politics, alcohol, religion, sex, narcotics, isms like communism, and pork, depending on the culture of the country where the books are being used. So there's a whole series of and a huge debate around it. You can Google. When I started having a look yesterday, I couldn't believe how much debate there is around this, about whether we're making the resources uninteresting and irrelevant, and taking away free thinking and freedom of speech by not including these subjects which are a part of life, or whether it's not the place for them. So I think there's a huge debate. You could do a podcast on PARSNIPS alone, I think. From my personal experience of teaching languages, I think that it's always a great opportunity in the language classroom to get a debate going. And the more you can spark the interest of the student, the more they're going to want to practice the language, because they want to communicate with you and they want to speak. But at the same time, I think going back to teachers and how much pressure is on them and how much is expected of them these days, it is important to also be aware that they're not necessarily specialists in these subjects, and it is a lot to ask of them to say, well, let's talk about politics in great detail in the language classroom. Great, that's really nice, but they may not feel comfortable or like they have the knowledge to. People are also trained to be politics teachers or sex ed teachers, or so if the teacher feels comfortable, and that's an area that we also try to support them in when we offer teacher training, is how can we help provide them with resources. Very recently we created a series of diversity, equity and inclusion based resources which covers a huge broad scope of things. But we know from our research with teachers that they want to talk about LGBTI rights, and they want to talk about neurodiversity, and they want to talk about prejudice and about privilege. but they don't necessarily feel comfortable opening these debates with their students for all they think that it's necessary. So we went out and spoke to a bunch of specialists and put together some resources which we've made available for free, with a huge amount of teachers' notes to support them and say, okay, well, if this is a controversial subject, how do you create a classroom environment that makes students feel safe and makes them comfortable enough to give their thoughts and reflections on the topic?
Well, you highlighted two really, really important elements of teaching. First of all, a lot of us assume that teachers are trained in socio-emotional issues, and that's usually not true. And so we're asking teachers to help the students feel comfortable with something that they really know nothing or very little about. And so they're doing it on instinct. And what you're saying is a lot of the publications, and your publication in particular, you're now including some information. So it may not come up in the training and the official training, but at least it's giving them some more information and strategies, I would assume, right?
Yeah, strategies, advice from experts, and classroom management, because previously the education model was the teacher speaks, the children repeat, or the class is silent and the class gets on with their work. And research has shown that project-based learning, that communication activities, that group work, that all of these different ways of learning are much more effective, having different models and different formats. But again, not all the teachers necessarily have had this training, and not all of them necessarily feel comfortable. And I can only imagine how difficult it must be to have 35-year-olds running around and trying to get them to do a communication activity and thinking, it's not easy. But that's where the teacher's book comes in handy, because it gives a series of tips and support. While I'm sure they would prefer to have 6 teaching assistants, but given the budget that most schools don't have, it's better than nothing. It's an extra help.
No, it's very important. And I suggest to teachers all the time that classroom management is fundamental. It's at least 50% of teaching. And I worked with one academy that was just moving into preschool, and they knew nothing about preschool children that age. And when I gave them a few strategies, the next week, it was unbelievable, the difference, just simple strategies. So the fact that you're offering those shows, again, the knowledge of what's really happening in the classroom that's coming from marketing. I would not have known that.
It's continuous research, continuous. Even once the books have been launched, the research team are in contact with the teachers that are using the books, and changes get made or additions get created even after the book has been released. And that allows for constantly creating a material that's more adequate to the needs of the class. So, for example, one of our secondary books has the sort of the standardized format, let's say, and then with the digital application that the teachers have, they have versions of the activities. So, for example, if one of the students is dyslexic, the same reading exercise will be available, but the design will be different, because experts have looked at the format and gone, okay, well, for somebody who's dyslexic, the design on this page is very colorful, it's very attractive, it's great to keep the attention of your average teenager because it's not boring. But for somebody who's dyslexic, this is extremely confusing and it's distracting. And if what you want is them to be able to read the text and take it in, then it needs to have a completely different design, have things stripped away. So there are all these things that are taken into consideration. That's where the value comes from, effectively, is that you're meeting the needs of in an ideal world, of the whole class.
And this is digital, and it's not anything extra, it's what you offer.
It's part of the product. So it's available within the digital platform for teachers, and then they can print it out and use it separately for as needed. And the same with tests, for example. The tests are made available at a standard level, and then there's a slightly higher level and a slightly lower level. So there's always attention to diversity and inclusion in all of the materials that we create. But I think also that's part of the value that perhaps is not seen by parents or people who aren't teachers or who aren't editors or authors, is the need to be updating the books. Because I can imagine that a lot of parents would say, well, what's wrong with using a book from 50 years ago? The verb to be hasn't changed, the past tense hasn't changed, and it hasn't, which is good news for those of us who studied languages previously, I suppose. But what has evolved and what has improved is our knowledge around ways of learning and needs in terms of the learner's needs. So each time a publisher publishes a new book, it's always an improvement on the previous in terms of what it offers in support for teachers and in support for learners.
Well, Rachel, I have to tell you that even though we've spoken before, I still have been a skeptic about textbooks, because when I first started teaching, I worked in a charter school in the States, and we did not believe in books. We were not allowed to buy textbooks. And so I created all my own lessons, and I think I did fairly well. However, I am not an expert on all this, and I would not have known what to do for a dyslexic student, and I would not have known what to do for an autistic student, for instance, or for Down syndrome. And although I did include images that were fairly diverse, not completely diverse, I know now. And I know that the experts I've worked with say that the textbooks are really valuable, and we can use them not maybe as the Bible, but as one of our primary resources. And as you're speaking, I'm now imagining a parent holding that textbook with, roses floating out, just so many elements floating out from them because of what you're describing. There's one other element, and I think you sort of touched on this, but I was talking to a math teacher in California, and I said, I have a lot of activities that I can give to you to help the lesson be more dynamic. And she said, listen, there's nothing I can do until I address the fact that there are transgender students in my classes, and it's very disruptive, and they need to feel seen. So you've touched on the subject briefly of that diversity as well. What could you tell me about the inclusion of that in the publications?
I think it's representation. It's that, and then the psychologists say that discrimination is something that's learned. It's not something that we're not born discriminating against others. We're born very open-minded. We learn discrimination. So it's vital that the textbooks that they're using, which is something that they're looking at 5 days a week, however many hours a week, that be representative of the reality of the world that they're a part of. And that they understand that different is not bad. Different is different. Different is neutral. You don't have to like everyone, but you have to respect everyone. And that understanding other people's realities and also what may be affecting them, learning empathy, feeling safe within the classroom, because all students will have a different home environment. And in my opinion, one responsibility but huge opportunity that teachers and schools have is to compensate for what may be lacking in other personal areas. And if the teacher can sit down at the beginning of the year and say, okay, rather than going straight into the curriculum, I'm going to spend the first week doing some icebreakers, helping the students get to know each other, letting them get to know me, making sure everyone feels comfortable. None of us can work or learn when we feel afraid or pressured or rejected or judged, or anything that makes us psychologically shut down is a huge problem when it comes to learning. So I think making visible reality, there are a lot of political conversations around this now and about ideology, and I think it's just a case of allowing students to understand what the world is like before as they're going out into it.
So it sounds like what you're saying is the more we can normalize these things, the more there is not a disconnect. And children will even say it's just the ignorance about something. It's not knowing, it's not understanding that person or that culture or whatever that makes it maybe scary. And the experts do say that no matter what is going on at home can be mitigated in the classroom and vice versa. But what I hear you saying is the publications do address this. And so it helps normalize these issues, and it helps the teachers and the students talk about their personal feelings about it, right?
Yeah, it gives them the opportunity to discuss different topics. And a lot of it will be subconscious as well. The fact that you haven't got what you referred to earlier of just a picture of a white boy and a white girl, but you start seeing all of these different realities, just starts normalizing everything from an age where they go, okay, well, this is part of the world that I live in, and that's great.
So a parent holding that book, that is definitely part of it. So I have one last question for you, and then I'm going to ask you if I've missed anything about marketing that you think that is really important for parents and teachers to know. I have an underlying philosophy about how I facilitate learning, and I won't say teaching because I don't go into a classroom to teach. I go in to help my students learn, and that's a very important distinction. And my underlying philosophy is essentially agency. I want them to become empowered, and I want them to feel empowered. Is there in the marketing world in Macmillan an underlying philosophy behind the books?
Absolutely. I think I can't speak for everyone. in the education sector, but I would say by and large it's vocational. It's not a sector where we're making millions. It's not, if you want to be buying a yacht, it's not the sector to work in. I think everybody that works as a teacher, as an educator, as an educational publisher, as an author, and as an editor, it's something that we believe in. And each publisher will have its own set of values. I think by and large they're probably all similar, which is furthering education, stimulating education and furthering learning. And that's definitely the case in Macmillan, that we have a set of values where we want to help teachers be change makers and create a future where the students learn how to learn and are empowered and have a set of values and a set of capabilities that they can then apply and put together the knowledge and the competencies to go into the world and continue learning and continue growing, but that it be an agent for change, effectively.
An agent of change. I love the term. And an agent of change in what direction? Because I guess what I'm asking is, there's some reason why you wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to work and I'm happy about it. So what is it that you think that you as the marketing team are offering for the well-being of the world, we could say? I know I get dramatic, but that really is.
No, but it's a belief I share. It sounds really twee, but any of my close friends will tell you that they're sick of hearing me talking about education in my free time. It is something I genuinely believe in, and I've had job offers to move into different sectors over the years, and they don't align with my values, and I can't see myself ever not working in education or volunteering in my free time for education, because to me it's the foundation of everything. You turn on the news or you read the news and it's just so depressing. And I can't help but think most of the time that education could either prevent the problem or solve the problem. But we have so many, war, conflict, many of the issues that we have are a lack of empathy or a lack of critical thinking. We know that technology has the ability to manipulate us, so it's vital that we learn to think. And we practice thinking and we practice debating and playing devil's advocate. But also I think the set of values is absolutely fundamental, because just criticizing somebody else's ideas is not a solution either. You need to be able to say it respectfully, communicate it in a way that it's heard and not rejected, and doesn't just create a sort of form of defensiveness. And all of these things are coming out in educational materials currently in a way that 20 years ago you weren't expected to think, you're expected to memorize. And I think it's so important, an education without wanting to sound like we're in some utopia is the solution to a lot of these things.
Not only are the linguistic skills there, but also the negotiation skills, because negotiation encompasses so much. It really encompasses compassion and empathy and paraphrasing and seeing the world from other people's perspectives and perhaps not agreeing with it, but respecting it, right?
Yeah. Languages is great for that, because languages opens the doors to different customs and cultures and understanding what you can gain from that and the importance. And I know for a lot of kids, it's difficult for them. It just feels like another subject. And I would never want to push onto anyone. It's really useful that you learn German, Chinese, French, whatever language it is. But I do think it's really good for opening up your mind and starting to make you think about different cultures, different customs, and the reality for people in different parts of the world.
Well, I love that, because it really does close up what we were talking about. Is there anything else about marketing that you feel that I may not have asked you that's so important for parents and teachers to know about, or you think that we've covered most of it?
I think we've covered most of it. I think it's just important to say that there's a whole tribe of people working behind any book you see, and also what you see on the page is not the only material that's being used. So I think it's a very interesting world, and it's one that requires constant thinking and questioning. And just to take a moment to say hats off to all the teachers that are doing such a fantastic job under such a huge amount of pressure, because it's not easy, any of their day-to-day, and it's vital the work they're doing.
So that parent holding that book now has a lot more information. And I just really appreciate all of this knowledge that you've given us about marketing and about your philosophy, about the philosophy that does exist in the marketing department.
Yeah, and I hope that parents do now take the time to open up their kids' books and have a look, because A huge amount of effort goes in as well to making them not boring. We don't want the kids to suffer. You learn if you're having fun, but there's content that's interesting, and there's content that makes you think and makes you question. And there's a huge amount of time and effort goes into curating these materials, and they're interesting.
And one thing that's really important to say there is that the book is in English. It has really interesting topics, but at home, it could be discussed in the home language. It doesn't have to be discussed in English. And just like the best children's movies, there's always something that's the humor for an adult. Otherwise, an adult is not going to want to take their child to the movie. The same with these books. There's an interest for everybody.
Absolutely. And one final bit of advice that I think I should have mentioned earlier, you were asking about how parents can help support their children's learning. With what's available now through the multimedia and the digital part, I'm based in Spain, and I know that friends of mine who are Spanish, native Spanish speakers, and want to help their children learn English, they struggle with the accent. They may speak English, but they struggle with feeling like their accent doesn't sound like British English or American English or native English. And so the great thing that parents can encourage their kids to utilize is all of this multimedia, the songs, the videos, the audio activities that are created for the level of the book, allows you to hear a variety of different accents.
Yeah, I mean, you and I are a perfect example of this. And some people will actually say, do you understand her? Because the accent is different. She's speaking English. It's just a different accent. But yeah, that's really important that they're aware of that. So thank you for adding that. Rachel, I think we've done it. I think we have clarified marketing.
I hope so. I hope it's awoken an interest in people to go and have a look at the books that their kids are using, or their nieces and nephews are using, or their neighbors are using.
Beautiful. Rachel, thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Now tell me, really, were you not incredulous about the compassion and thought behind the publisher's books? Was it not inspirational to hear Rachel talk about how important it is to give students opportunities to verbalize and express diversity? Be respectful of differences, become educated not just in language, but in culture, in preferences, in concerns, in needs, in priorities, basically everything that makes us be more effective global citizens. That's what's in these publishers' books. What would you do about the PARSNIPS elements? Would you include them in your lessons? Would you seek out publications that help you address these controversial subjects? So much to think about, and I'd love your comments on them. So for more informational conversations like this, look at past and future episodes of Doorways to Learning with Donna and activities to introduce dense content at scaffoldingmagic.com. In the meantime, have fun at your classes and at home, and see you next week for more.